Hello Year 2, how are you? And welcome to today's reading lesson. Now today we're going to be carrying on with Fantastic Mr. Fox and looking at chapter 4, which is called The Terrible Shovels. Oh, I wonder what happens in that chapter. Well, today we are going to be using the skill of prediction. So we're going to make predictions about what might happen based on what we've read already today and in previous chapters. So we're also going to use previous chapters to help us make our predictions. And like every lesson, we're also going to be looking at some vocabulary. So we're going to be looking at a word, looking at the words around that word and trying to come up with a meaning or a definition for the word. But before we do any of that, we are going to see if we can explain what has happened so far in the story. So we're going to look at what you can remember from chapter 3. So here are your retrieval questions. So you've got, what did Mr. Fox catch a glint of behind the tree? What did the farmers find on the ground? And what was Farmer Bean's plan? Now, if you need to use the pages that I sent you last lesson, that's completely fine, to refresh your memory before you answer these questions. But if you can answer them from memory, that is also brilliant. So yeah, to pause the video now and have a go at your retrieval questions. Okay, so let's go through the answers together to see how much we can remember. Well, number 1, what did Mr. Fox catch a glint of behind the tree? Well, I remember that it was night time, wasn't it? And Mr. Fox's eyes were described as sharp, so he could see very well. And he caught a glint of something bright behind the tree, didn't he? And remember, it was a speck of moonlight. Can you remember what speck means? Yes, it's a little bit, isn't it, like a spot? So it was a speck of moonlight shining on a polished surface. Now, do you remember what the polished surface was? Yes, fantastic. It was the barrel of a gun, wasn't it? It was the gun of one of the 3 farmers who were hiding behind the trees, waiting for Fantastic Mr. Fox. Okay, number 2, what farmers find on the ground? Well, can you remember? With their torches, they looked on the ground and they found the poor, tattered, blood-stained remains of a fox's tail. Do you know whose tail? Can you remember whose tail that belonged to? Yes, you're right. It was part of Fantastic Mr. Fox's tail, wasn't it? But they only got the end of his tail, but he managed to escape. Okay, then finally, what was Farmer Bean? Well, their last plan had failed, hadn't it? Because Mr. Fox had escaped. So at the end of the chapter, they came up with the plan that they were going to dig Mr. Fox and his family out of their home. And at the end of the chapter, one of the farmers says, let's get the shovels. Okay, so they're going to use shovels to help dig out Mr. Fox and his family. Okay, fantastic. Well done. If you've remembered those answers, that's brilliant. Now, I said today that we are predicting, aren't we? Now, what does predicting mean? Can you remember? Pause the video now and have a think. Okay, Year 2. Well, today our friend Predicting Pip is going to help us. Shall we see what Predicting Pip is going to help us to do? He is going to help us to predict what might happen based on what has been read so far. And as I said, what has been read today and what has been read in previous chapters. So that means that she is there to help you to see into the future. So we're predicting what is happening next, because we don't know, do we? But based on what we've already read, we need to predict what's going to happen in the future. And look, can you see she's got her glass ball ready to help us to see what's in the future? Now, what type of questions might Predicting Pip ask us and help us with? Well, she might ask us, as I said, what do you think will happen next? So we have to use our knowledge of what we've read so far, which will help us to predict. She might also ask us, what do you think the character will say in reply to that? Now, we know the characters in Fantastic Mr. Fox and what they're like, don't we? So therefore, we can use what they're like and what we know has happened to them in the past to predict what they might say in response to a question. And finally, she might help us to answer the question, how do you think the story will end? So again, we're looking into the future. We're using our glass ball, like predicting Pippies. And we are predicting, based on what we've read so far, how the story will end. Now, shall we look at one type of question that Predicting Pip might ask us when we do our independent work later? Okay, well, she might ask us to tick one of the answers based on what this child, so it says, which of these do you think the child is likely to say at the end of the outing? And you need to read the different things that that child might say, and then using your knowledge of what has happened during the child's outing, during the child's day, we can predict what they might say at the end of the outing. So we've got, that was fun, Mum. Can you do it all over again? That was scary. I never want to do it again. That was really boring, Dad. And that was great, Dad. Let's do it again. Okay, so you need to choose based on what you've already read, what that child is most likely to say. Now, we haven't read this story, so we can't answer this question, but this is a type of question that you might get for Fantastic Mr. Fox. And you need to tick one of the answers, okay? Only one, because it says tick one. Now, let's start reading our chapter 4 called The Terrible Shovels. Now, I've sent you this on your resource, Year 2 Reading, 2nd of February, Resource 1. Okay, so you have it there at hand. Okay, so let me start. Chapter 4, The Terrible Shovels. Down in the hole, Mrs. Fox was tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail to stop the bleeding. It was the finest tail for miles around, she said between the licks. It hurts, said Mr. Fox. I know it does, sweetheart, but it'll soon get better, and it will soon grow again, Dad, said one of the small foxes. It will never grow again, said Mr. Fox. I shall be tailless for the rest of my life. He looked very glum. Now, in the first sentence, we have the word tenderly. Mrs. Fox was tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail to stop the bleeding. Now, tenderly is an adverb, isn't it? Because it is describing how Mrs. Fox was licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail. So it is an adverb because it is giving more information about the verb. Now it's got 3 syllables. Are you ready to clap them with me? 3, 2, 1. Tenderly. There we go. And it means that she's being gentle, she's being kind, and she's being loving, because tenderly means with gentleness, kindness, and love. So when Mrs. Fox is licking Mr. Fox's tail to help stop the bleeding, she is doing it gently, and she's being very kind. She's trying to help him, and she's doing it with love because it's her husband, isn't it? Now, some synonyms. Remember, synonyms mean the same thing, so they're different words with the same meaning. So synonyms of tenderly are carefully, so she's being very careful, delicately, and gently. Okay, so that was part of our definition, but gently is an adverb which can be used as a synonym of tenderly. Now, some antonyms of this word. We can have harshly and unkindly. Well, Mrs. Fox definitely isn't licking his tail harshly, is she? Because he's hurt. So therefore, she's trying to help him. She was doing it harshly. That wouldn't be very nice, wouldn't it? And unkindly, well, again, she's trying to help him. So she's not being unkind, is she? So therefore, it is an antonym of tenderly, not a synonym. We can say as well, I know we've got the example in this book, but we can also say she hugged her mother tenderly. So if you hug your mother tenderly, you're doing it gently and you're showing her lots of love by hugging her. Okay, fantastic. Well, let's carry on with our story. Okay. There was no food for the foxes that night, and soon the children dozed off. Then Mrs. Fox dozed off. But Mr. Fox couldn't sleep because of the pain in the stump of his tail. Well, he thought, I suppose I'm lucky to be alive at all. And now they've found our hole, we're going to have to move out as soon as possible. We'll never get any peace if we... What was that? Okay, what was that? He turned his head sharply and listened. So this is where we're going to look at our first prediction question. So Mr. Fox has said, what was that? And the question is, what do you think Mr. Fox has heard and why? Okay, so we're going to look at this one together. Now, there are some key words in our question. When we have a question, we always need to look for the key words. So the key words in this question are think, because remember, we don't know the answer yet. We are making a prediction. So this is based on what you think, based on what you've read already. We've also got heard. So it needs to be a noise, doesn't it? Because he's heard something. So it's going to definitely be a noise that we're looking for. And then we also have the word why. Now, you need to explain, not just say what you think it is, but explain using what you've read already, why you think it is that. Okay, now, what was that? Well, he's heard a noise, hasn't he? I wonder what that noise might be. Well, let's have a look at the end of chapter 3. That might help us out. So let me read it to you. Bean pulled a flask from his pocket and took a swig of cider. Then he said, it'll take 3 days at least before he gets hungry enough to come out again. I'm not sitting around here waiting for that. Let's dig him out. Ah, said Boggis. Now you're talking sense. We can dig him out in a couple of hours. We know he's there. I reckon there's a whole family of them down that hole, Bunce said. Then we'll have the lot. Get the shovels, okay? So, do you think this might have something to do with what Mr. Fox can hear right now? Well, yes, I think it probably does, because look, we've got let's dig him out and we've got get the shovels. So, could it be the farmers or the shovels that Mr. Fox is hearing while he's trying to sleep? Well, yes, we can predict it is, can't we? Because we know that the farmers are planning to dig Mr. Fox and his family out of their hole. And we know that they're using shovels. So it could be a scraping sound of the shovels. So therefore, we could say in the red, I think Mr. Fox has heard the 3 farmers digging. Okay, so that is what I think. That is a short sentence about what I think. Now I need to go into why, because remember, the second part of the question asks me why. And I've said, I think Mr. Fox has heard the 3 farmers digging because at the end of chapter 3, after their previous plan had failed, they decided to dig him and his family out of the hole. Mr. Bean ordered the others to get the shovels. So therefore, Mr. Fox can probably hear the shovels. So he can probably hear the scraping sound of the shovels. So can you see, I have used what I read at the end of chapter 3 about the farmer's plan. And I have used it to predict what I think Mr. Fox might have heard and use this in my explanation of why. So I've used what I've read in chapter 3 in my explanation. Okay, so let's carry on reading. Okay, so we're back to page number 16. Okay, so where are we? What was that? He turned his head sharply and listened. The noise he heard now was the most frightening noise a fox can ever hear. The scrape, scrape, scraping of shovels digging into the soil. Oh, so we were right, weren't we? There we go. So we looked back at chapter 3 and we've made a correct prediction because we used what we already knew from chapter 3 about the farmer's plan.